Only mode.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on contributing to a positive workplace, which is part of the mentorship program that's organized by the Career Support Committee of AAMC. So first I should probably thank the committee co-chairs, Michelle Jacques and Christina Nielsen, along with the AAMC Director, Judith Pinero, and Program Manager, Hannah Teskey, for working to set up this program. So today we're actually addressing the current group of mentors for this year, but I believe later the webinar will be available for viewing on the AAMC website. So just sort of a quick procedural note, we'll be treating this session as essentially a conversation. So I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions at any time, I think using the dialog box that should be on the right of your screen. But first we'll start with sort of a discussion among the speakers, and then unless someone has a question that's really relevant to the conversation at that moment, I'll look for more questions from the participants in the later part of our session. So to begin, my name is Sarah Lees, and I'm Hardman Curator of European Art at Philbrook Museum in Tulsa. I am joined by two distinguished speakers, Tuliza Fleming, who is Curator of American Art at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and by Mark Pascale, who is the Duchossois Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago and Adjunct Professor of Art in Print Media at the School of the Art Institute. So you should be able to find more detailed biographies of the speakers on the AAMC website, and I'll just briefly say about the two speakers that Tuliza has been at her museum, I think nearly from the beginning. It was founded in 2003.
I've been there.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And during that time, she has worked to develop the collection of American art. She has curated wide-ranging exhibitions, including visual art and the American experience. And she's published numerous essays and articles that explore the intersections of art, politics, and culture. Mark Pascale is a lithographer, a curator, and a professor of art who has been active in those roles for over 35 years. He has curated exhibitions and published essays on artists including Saul Steinberg and Martin Puryear, and he's currently developing exhibitions on, among other things, a group of Chicago artists who came together in the 60s and were known as the Harry Who. I would love to hear more about that, as well as both of your projects. But the main question we'll be considering here is rather more broadly focused and also more personal at the same time. And that is how curators can contribute to creating a positive work environment through mentor relationships. So the idea that we're proposing is that by developing mentoring interactions and relationships with junior staff across an organization, more senior staff members can actively help to advance both individual and more broadly institutional goals. So to begin to dig into that question, perhaps you could both start by describing your current professional situations, and maybe just talk about what kinds of interactions between junior and senior staff members are part of your everyday experiences. So Tuliza, do you want to begin?
Okay. I have been Curator of American Art for about 10 years at the museum. When I first started, besides myself, there were 3 other people in our department. We now have 14 curators, and we have museum specialists, researchers, catalogers. We have a digi team, registrars, collection managers, conservators, and management support specialists in the department. So it's turned out to be a very large department. And I think when I came on board, there were about roughly 25 employees. We now have 250. So having watched that organization grow, I'm one of the, as one of the oldest staff members, yes, I have sort of ushered in a lot of people, and a lot of my mentorship activity has been peer-to-peer, as well as with junior staff members, fellows, internships, etc. And I'm sorry, what's the second half of your question?
Just essentially that, what is the sort of structure that you work within, and how that maybe already sets up a certain type of relationship between you and other colleagues.
Yeah, I think that with regard to my other colleagues, as the department has grown, working at the Smithsonian is very, very different than working at most other museum institutions, and a lot of my colleagues did not come from museums, and the federal government has a very different structure. When I first started working, I came from a private institution into a federal government institution, and that can be jarring in the sense that there's multi-layered processes that happen, and I think that the structure of the Smithsonian is a little different. For example, my PD is museum's curator, which I didn't quite understand what that meant, but it is a title that is specific to the Smithsonian Institution, but it's not necessarily carried over in other institutions. So I think that having been there so long, a lot of my colleagues, when they came in, come to me to ask how this structure works. And we also have curators that have come from academic backgrounds as well. And some curators, this is their first curatorial position. So there's just a lot of interaction, not only in bringing a traditional curator in from another institution, but bringing curators in who may have never curated before, or may come from academic backgrounds, or just this may be something that they started off once they came out of grad school and sort of worked their way up to a curatorial position.
Okay. Mark, do you have some comments about your position?
Sure. I've been at the museum for quite a long time now, but even longer at the school. So my background was as an artist. So I'm an accidental curator. I didn't set out to become one, and in fact didn't really know what it was, even though I spent lots of time in the museum with colleagues looking at work. The department that I work in, Department of Prints and Drawings, is where the collection started actually in the late 19th century. And we are often referred to as a museum within the museum. So our museum, as large as it is, believe it or not, only has 10 curatorial departments, despite it being a encyclopedic collection. And within those 10 or so departments, there are only about 30 curators total. So in Prints and Drawings, when we are fully employed, there are 5 people generally. I don't know if that will be the case going forward. Currently, there are only 2 of us on site. We have a kind of external one who's been working from California. For a while, it was just her and myself. So we're very depleted in terms of staff, but we keep going. And I think it's just, I think that we all know what we're doing. We all know what we're doing it for. We're all doing it for the same reason. And between the curators and a very large conservation staff, which is linked with us, we're all in the same space. Our vault, our study center, our curatorial offices, and the conservators are all together in one place. So a lot of interaction happens between conservators and curators. It's very interesting to me as someone who comes from a collaborative background. Printmaking is collaborative. So for me, there was a kind of natural flow in. As someone who was a professor who had graduate students working with them, the idea of mentorship, as someone who was mentored very well by faculty and who admired that process, I think it all comes naturally. And I know that it's not universal, but my general attitude is that everybody needs to be respected, and one needs to know everybody, whether they are a janitor or the president of the museum. The president of the museum is responsible for everybody. And when I was asked once to go to a Be a Better Person seminar for a week, I said, I think we could solve that by simply making sure that every time you confront a fellow employee, you ask them how they're doing, ask them what their name is, and just continue to do so, so that everybody understands that we're all on the same playing field. We're all there for the same reason. We're there to protect the art and make sure that the public has a good experience with it. That's my attitude. That's what I bring to mentoring, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So already it sounds like, I mean, as you say, some of it is kind of a common sense, just how you want to relate to other people in general. And I guess I'm wondering, I mean, you've also touched on this, that there are certain sort of situations already set up within your organization that sort of are designed to foster mentoring. So for example, internships, or I think it's interesting to have the different, areas, departments that are often separated, meaning conservation and curatorial in your case, Mark, so that you can work together with different people who are at different levels of their career. Any comments about sort of the personal versus the institutional kind of relationships?
Tuliza, you want to start, or do you want me to?
You can start, Mark, if you like.
Okay. Prints and Drawings in our museum has a very long, dedicated internship program. So we have them for a while we had them every semester. We've reduced it to a full year. We raised money to pay them. So we only take 2 a year, and it's for a whole academic year. And then we have a separate group of them in the summer. It's a very intense program, and we spend a lot of time with them. In fact, I used to complain that with 7 or 8 interns, it was hard to get your work done if you really wanted to give them a good experience. And so we have them doing everything that we do. And we also, when people come to us and say, we don't copy, I say, well, I copy, so that's fine. I'll copy. You don't have to copy if you don't want to. Everybody does everything. So I think, in terms of the personal, I try to leave work and not take it home, and I try to come to work without bringing my personal issues with me from home. And I am generally thought of as being a very happy, well-adjusted person who tries to laugh first, even when it's very absurd. I find the whole museum thing very absurd. There's a lot of stuff that happens within it that seems very counterintuitive and funny somehow. Funny, not haha funny, but bizarre. And so I try to maintain a kind of even attitude about things, to look at problems from a slower philosophical point of view, to try to diffuse hysteria. I think there's a lot of hysteria in museums that seems not well placed. And I like to think of my door as being open, and people can come in anytime if they have a problem, be very frank about it. And I think that's in part because I feel like our human resources department is spineless. And so, I think there's so many issues with liability now that somebody has to have a place where they can go and just be themselves, and that's my office. So that's my whole function here, I think, beyond the other work that I do, the acquisitions that I make, the lectures that I give, the shows that I organize. It's really about creating a generous, collegial, collaborative atmosphere, and I think that everybody should do that. That's I'm collaborative with the janitors. They have a job to do, and we rely upon them, and I like to make sure that they're okay.
I think
they're not treated.
I agree 100% with what Mark said. And my personal background, my father is a museum director and started a lot of museums. He calls himself a builder of museums. And I think growing up in a museum environment, you realize, as Mark was saying, that these departments aren't separate. They are connected in a way that the museum can't be successful if everyone doesn't work together as one entity. And I think that sometimes people forget that, and they sort of lose perspective, and sometimes there can be a lot of competitive behavior. Also, in my museum, it was a very high stressful environment. When the museum was founded, we had 0 objects. And we also had a very limited budget to acquire objects. So I think that the most we ever received, and we received our money from Congress, was $1.2 million a year. And that's on the high end in terms of acquisitions. So I think that there was this scramble as curators came on board, and some of them came on board as recently as 3 years ago, to sort of build these individual collections from scratch while we're also building the museum. And in other departments, there is this feeling of being siloed because you're not in a normal situation. And it was a very sort of high stress situation. However, I've worked as consultants for a startup museum. So a lot of what, oh, that's my cat playing with his toy. So sorry about that. But I had seen this all before. I knew what to expect. I knew that if you didn't sort of take perspective, you would get burnout. It's not everything is not the end of the world, although even I felt it many times it was the end of the world and dealing with that stress. I think for me though, I'm naturally an extremely social person. And I'm the type of person who gets up and visits my colleagues, gets to know my colleagues, and really, I think many people, I assume, since they do come into my office, like Mark says, and you can ask for advice, or you can just have a sympathetic ear, And the other thing that I generally do is, for example, when new people come in, when I could, the museum grew extraordinarily fast toward the end. So there were a lot of people that I did not know, from a few people to 250, and we also had, as we grew, separate spaces. So we have 4 different locations, so you don't always see everyone anymore, and there are people who are coming in that you don't know. But within the museum structure and within our office space, which is about a mile away, one can interact on a more regular basis. And I think that this idea of even socializing with some of your colleagues, if you like them enough, outside of the museum is really beneficial to forming relationships that if you do need something from someone within your department or someone outside of your department, people feel much more comfortable and helpful providing that, and vice versa. So this idea of making people feel welcome, people don't really forget that, especially in a really brand new environment that's extremely high stress.
Right. It sounds like in both cases, I mean, particularly when you're actually creating a new museum, and then within an institution that has such a long, history and kind of structure, that that personal component really is almost the most significant. And then it's kind of your own attitude towards, as you say, Mark, to have your door open essentially so that anyone can walk in, or to socialize outside. I think those are key ingredients in these kinds of, relationships of any type, mentoring, and just in general. I'm wondering if there are any difficulties or obstacles that you might have encountered in terms of these kinds of interactions in your experience?
Always.
Always.
Yeah. I mean, there are very prickly people who work here. One of my favorite expressions is the woman who is the assistant to the corporation counsel, who's a remarkable organizer and absolutely perfect in every way, including her sense of humor, used to say, "Welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago, where every time is the first time." Which means that there was absolutely no standardization to anything, and everything changed, like it seemed like on an ad hoc basis. And we were joking before we started here. It's like one of my favorite expressions is if I said I didn't know that was true, and they'd say it's on the web, read it. It's like, oh, good, thanks for telling us. So the obstacles, I guess, are communication. Communication is always an obstacle, particularly in a big institution. And it can be as simple as understanding what system to use to bring an object in, how loans work. I mean, even someone carrying a work of art in from the outside for examination by us that's something that seems to constantly change. It used to be you went in, you checked in through security, they gave you a pass, the curator signed the pass, and they walked out with it and showed the pass to the. Now there's a whole different thing that has to take place, and I think. It links through the registrar's office. So the registrar is scrutinizing everything that comes and goes, and it's probably a good idea, but it came down in one of these, suddenly, you can't do it that way anymore, Mark. I said, okay, well, how do you do it? I'm happy, here, I wanna know, tell me, and I'll do it right. Instead of, getting all mad and, throwing things or what, calm is the best thing, calm, everybody stay calm.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because speaking of everything's always changing, everything was brand new.
Yeah.
Our policies, of course, grew as we grew as a museum, and even how we brought in objects and the process is constantly changing. And now that we're open, we're in the process of changing the process again. And I think that that can be frustrating. And again, some of my colleagues who have not been through that process before are like, why this and not that? Even for me, why do we have to do this? And that can be difficult to navigate. I think that dealing with, as Mark said, the stress and different personalities. I used to take things very, very, very seriously and personally, and I would get upset. And my father kept telling me, you take things too personally. And I said, but it is personal. It is personal. It's happening to me. And he was like, yeah, you're taking things too personally. And I remember I had this, and I didn't know what he was talking about. And then I had this epiphany that a lot of times when people are reacting to you in a certain way, it has nothing to do with you. They may bring something into the office from their personal life, or they might have just gotten chewed out once by someone, or something disappointing happened. I mean, I had an interaction with one of my colleagues that, you know, I thought was pretty over the top. And I didn't respond, and I said, okay. And I went back to my office and I said, this couldn't possibly be about anything that I said or did. And a couple hours later, she came to my office and she said, I'm sorry, I'm dealing with my mom. She was diagnosed with cancer. I didn't mean to snap at you. And I said, that's okay, because I figured that, you know, the situation didn't warrant the reaction, and I knew her long enough that it was unlike her. And I think that a lot of the ways to mitigate this is when you get to know your colleagues, is to step out of your office, stop emailing everything. Certainly there are things that are most appropriate to email and get in writing, but other things, just going and having a conversation about your needs and finding out what's really important for me is finding out what your colleagues are dealing with. So if you're going to your colleague and you want them to do something, you need to know whether or not they're overwhelmed with some other task or other deadline. And so if they are late getting back to you, or if they're unresponsive, you know that that department is dealing with some major issue, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't talk to them on a regular basis. And it makes you more understanding. And I do often talk to people about just going in someone's office, chatting, find out what's going on in their lives and or what's going on in their particular career path. It's really helpful in terms of keeping calm and in terms of staying happy and keeping perspective.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, that once you have created more of these relationships, that actually helps the whole organization function better, because as you say, you can be more adaptable, you can kind of give people greater leeway and to deal with their own situations. Yeah, that's a great point.
And maybe not ask for that favor at that point in time. Can you live without it for 2 weeks while they meet that deadline? Or are you going to complain to their supervisor because they didn't respond to your email? I mean, I think that some things are really just as simple as walking down the hallway or going to another floor. You know?
Absolutely. That's a great point.
I agree 1000% with that. It's crucial. It's absolutely crucial to be in front of somebody and talking with them. The other thing that I was thinking of when you were talking is that you used the term silo before, and that became a very popular term under one of our previous directors. And it was apt, I think, in a lot of ways. I think they're among the curators who worked here at the time, one of them or two of them or more actually said, I like my silo. And that's something that you always have to fight, I think. And, you know, when they become directors, it's a different ballgame, and they're identifying that, but they were always that before. And so I think, as you suggested, that it's super important to know what's on their minds and what's going on with them. And sometimes that's a lunchtime conversation or a coffee conversation. One of the things that is long forgotten here, when I first started working here, I was introduced to some people. They pretty much left me on my own in my department. But the thing that was an organized thing that was great and is no longer done was that the director had a coffee every month. And it wasn't required, but it was the most collegial 1 hour of every month for all the curators. They congregated in his office, coffee was provided, and you found out more about what people's projects were, how they were, what they looked like, who they were. It's, you know,
Right.
30 isn't that many people, but it is when you're, you know, nose to the grindstone. So
Sure.
I wish that they would bring that back. They do have curators forums here, but I don't even go to them because they seem like a platform to allow administrators to yak at us. And we never get to chat about our problems or what we're interested in or how we see our profession advancing or what we need as a staff to do our job better. We're just basically listening to their policies, and the policies, just like in academia, you have administrators now who've never been in a classroom. What do they know? But they're telling us what to do. And you know, I find all of that counterintuitive, and so I just ignore it. And I'm more apt to, one of the things that came out of that, my stepping away from that forum, was that the people really involved said, as a senior staff member, you should be doing more interacting with the younger staff. So would you please invite people out to lunch? Sure. And I got to know a lot of people that way. But you know, sometimes you worry. You don't want people to think that you are creeping on them or something like that. It's very delicate. But I think cutting through the problems with coffee or stepping aside and greeting them in their office or calling them on the phone as opposed to using email. Personal touch is always very good.
Right. Right. Now I do like the idea of something sort of semi-structured, like a coffee that's for the institution as a whole. So as you say, you don't have to feel like you're picking out individual people. And sometimes those things can be presented as, well, you know, the institution is trying to provide some social activities, but actually they do serve a really useful function in the way that you mentioned.
They did. They really did. Yeah. I miss them, actually.
Yeah, maybe we could recommend starting that up again.
I have.
Okay.
I think it fell on deaf ears.
Right. So just to switch to a slightly, not that different, but Tuliza, I think you mentioned that you yourself had a really good sort of mentor-mentee experience. I wonder if you can point to a couple of things sort of from either side of the equation that you found particularly helpful, useful.
Yeah, since college, I've, or maybe even, yeah, I would say college, I developed sort of mentoring relationships with people who were more established in the field. I think that I have a professor who is now a very good friend, and you know, we're talking about decades of knowing her and keeping in touch and asking for advice, and her inviting me to come and guest curate one of my earliest shows. One of the reasons why I decided to attend University of Maryland is because I wanted to work with David Driscoll, who is renowned for his interest in mentoring and has mentored, I don't know how, 30, 40, 50 people over the course of his career, as he was mentored by James Porter when he was a student. And I think this process of being mentored, as Mark said, really translates into how you interact with people, and the idea of people being generous with their time, generous with their advice, willing to read your scholarship or even graduate school papers, and continuing that relationship. So I was very proactive. So when I interned at museums, I kept in touch. And once I started perhaps my new museum, I might have called curators at my former museum as a younger curator, might have called curators who I worked with as interns and fellows, asking them for advice. And it really did help me make less mistakes than normally you would make, or even in situations where you're dealing with difficult workplace interactions. Their experiences, just telling you their experiences, help you feel better because you don't feel as alone. And I feel like I've developed certain relationships. I remember the first time somebody called me their mentor, I was really highly uncomfortable because I feel like I had enough experience to mentor anyone. I'm just flailing around myself, but she insisted on doing that because she said our conversations helped her. a lot. And I never forgot that because I didn't know what I could offer her, but clearly I had offered her something. Right. And a lot of the students I have, or I've worked with and have continued to look to me for advice, and even going outside of the immediate museum field. You know, I've worked with independent curators, you know, what's the best way to work with a museum to get a contract that's not going to really undermine you and your abilities and pay you less when you're working with a museum, because that happens all the time, as curators are taken advantage of. Or as an artist, how to present your work to a gallery, how to write your artist statement, how to present your portfolio, what you need to do to get for a museum to take interest in you, or budding collectors. How do you collect with the intent of giving to a museum, or what is your end game with collecting? This is advice that people really appreciate that you generally don't necessarily learn in school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mark, do you have some experiences to share?
I mean, I suppose I've had some parallel experiences, but again, you know, I didn't come up through art history or anything really even academic. It was art, and so visual art, and so being in the studio, I still tell people in graduate school that as good as your professors might be, your real mentor are your colleagues, you know, your contemporaries. I mean, I got more out of my fellow grads when I was in graduate school than I did from any individual faculty member, even though I became very close to one particular person. And the idea of consistent mentorship was very much fostered where I went to graduate school as it was where I went to undergraduate school. And in art school, it's not so much. I mean, that's what's weird about being in Chicago. The School of the Art Institute does not necessarily foster consistent mentorship. They kind of change it up and encourage people to take a lot of different mentors over the course of their 2 years or whatever, how many years they use, they stay in school. But I think that for me, it was more paying attention. And I mean, I was told no a lot growing up. And I was also told not to go to college by a guidance counselor. They told me that I was never succeed in college and I was too stupid to actually get through it. So I had very low expectations, and so my engagement with the field is a daily surprise and happiness that I did it anyway. And so I think no one really explained to me how that all worked. I mean, I did, as you said to Tuliza, you don't get a lot of stuff in school. And I think this is why when I teach a seminar class for the school, I do it without books, without reading, without writing. And it's a one-on-one or group engagement with things. And it's a way of stepping beyond the book and applying what you got from books. And I think that real life is really the test, and that all that other stuff is just preparation for it that doesn't really often connect with the way that life really is. So I guess I'm a school of hard knocks person. And so when people started saying no to me in the museum, it never bothered me. I just thought that's just life. That's more of the same. And you work around it and you work through it and you come up with another idea. And I also think that, as you suggested, that you do, whether you intend to or not, become a mentor by your example and by the way that you interact with people just normally. And I agree with you. I think when people call me Mr. now, I find that really weird. I mean, ask Christina Nielsen. I've always told her that she's way more mature than I am. My wife and I talk about stopping our growth at 18 and to always maintain the 18-year-old attitude because it's just too scary to grow up. You know, it's just too scary. You have a lot of responsibility, but you can still be immature. Make wise choices, but be immature.
I'm laughing because I'm an extremely silly person myself, and often joke around my colleagues, and it doesn't always have to be so serious all of the time. And I think lightening up is important. And I will also say that people do say no to you. all the time. And how do you navigate that? And, you know, I had some difficulties in graduate school. For example, I was never given a TA-ship, and a lot of that was personal. And so luckily, I didn't want to become a professor. I always knew that I wanted to do museums. So I just went out on my own and used my own connections and developed connections and applied for internships and got outside referrals. And I think that even working in museums that never had any money, you know, my former director at the Dayton Art Institute, you know, I want to do X, Y, and Z. He said, well, you know, you can do it, but you have to find the money yourself. And my attitude was, fine, I'll find the money myself and I'll get this done. And I figured out ways around what I wanted to do. So if I couldn't get that in that straight, you know, traditional line, you know, you always look around the box, over the box, under the box. And I think that sometimes that creativity is not necessarily encouraged because people feel like they have to do the same thing the same way all the time, which can even, it stagnates the field. And I think that creativity and doing something different and approaching a problem differently, like maybe not using established theory when you're writing your dissertation, create your own theory, you know, because at some point, you become the expert and you can forge your own path. And it's really important to encourage people to do that because it does make you more resilient and more successful, I think. So my experience with my former director saying, well, we don't have money, but figure it out, really helped me become a fundraiser and helped me get objects from people as donations. And it was something that I developed in terms of just even an intern mentorship with our advancement department. Getting people to give you art is getting people to give you money. So I went to that department and I said, can you show me the structure that you use as development officers to raise money? Because I need to familiarize myself with that so I can be more successful in doing what I needed to do. And she and a couple of other people sat down with me, gave me literature, and really helped me out in terms of how this is done, because studies have been done with regard to that, but in the curatorial field, they don't teach you how to solicit donations. You have to figure that out. Not everybody's personality is geared toward that. So how do you navigate that? And based upon that interaction with our department head, I gave a talk at a conference, how to use fundraising skills to build a collection. And that, I think, was the first time probably people really understood that, but it was so closely connected, but not necessarily what people think about when they're going out into the field and asking somebody for something worth $3 million. And sort of this fearlessness that you have to have is something that I learned from my colleagues and am able to pass on to my colleagues who have never or may feel very uncomfortable making an ask within an hour of meeting someone. Because you have to do that. And I mean, if you're dealing with corporate types, they understand that. You don't have to be delicate. Understanding who you're dealing with and how to work with that. So, you know, that kind of conversation was really helpful to me, and I think helpful to the newer curators who are coming in.
Right.
Yeah, that kind of experience of kind of going outside your immediate field to gain new skills is kind of almost like looking for other mentors in other areas to kind of help yourself. And I was also thinking, you know, the obstacles that people who say no are sort of like anti-mentors. They can be equally, you know, inspirational or motivating, I guess. But, you know, the idea that you want to actively create, excuse me, a more positive purpose is I think kind of what we're looking at. And also, I was interested in the idea that it's almost self-perpetuating, as you both said. You know that you know, if you get that kind of treatment early on, then it's part of your field of knowledge, and you can then sort of replicate it yourself.
Yeah, and one of the things with fundraising is, what do you do? One of the tenets is, what do you do when they say no? Well, you find out why they say no. What is the rationale behind saying no, because you might be able to turn that into a yes later on. But if you don't understand and you walk off in a huff, you know, you may never get what you want, but there may be a perfectly rational explanation why they say no. And once you understand that, you might be able to work within those parameters to get what you need to get done while, you know, understanding why it can't be done necessarily this way.
Right.
Yep.
At this point, I'd like to sort of ask the participants if they have any questions, maybe to start typing them. And I expect that might take a minute or two. So when that time, I know it's easy to ask for sort of a soundbite, but would either of you have kind of suggestions to offer? I mean, we've sort of been talking about a lot of them already, but strategies about how to think about your role, you know, just ways to interact to help further other people in their goals. I think we've touched on a lot, but
I think that one of the most valuable things for me, being someone who was not really prepared for this, was arriving in a department as a junior curator with people surrounded by people who had a lot more experience, to always listen to them and to solicit them at every phase of the job. And that includes showing them letters before I mailed them out to make sure that I wasn't being too direct. Also nowadays, to sometimes typing an email and not sending it, but making it a draft and then sitting on it and letting other people read it before you send it, can be very helpful. And I got that from them. And I feel like in a lot of ways I was thrown into the fire directly by everybody, but at every step of the way, I can remember, even if I had done something almost unforgivable, unintentionally or not, that there was forgiveness, because I didn't, you know, I wanted to be better. And I worked hard, and I think junior people really need to understand that, and to always be open-minded and listen. And I think that even though you have opinions, I think you should always express your opinions, but you'll have more opportunity to express them later and to be in this role that perhaps we're sitting in right now, that you develop wisdom, and it's important to share it, because wisdom was shared with me and I appreciated every step of my life, whether it was in school or even before college. I remember all of that stuff. My father was a teacher, and I remember a lot of what he said to me, even when it was incredibly, I don't know. His favorite expression was, "Hooray for you, to hell with everybody else." And I know when he said it to me, I was very hurt by it, but I remember having a come to Jesus moment when I realized what he was saying: love yourself first so that you can love everybody else. And I think that that was an incredibly valuable thing that he gave me. And I got him to repeat it all through his life. Every time we got together, we didn't live near each other. So whenever we got together, I would always say that again, please say it again. Because it was actually, it involved, you know, swearing.
Okay.
It was really, really awful. But it was very positive in the end.
Right. Tuliza, any thoughts, words of wisdom?
I would say to tell people to be fearless and ask for help. Ask people to give you advice. Not everybody will. Sometimes you don't have the time. I mean, there was a certain period of time during the process of building this museum where I could not take on mentors and fellows because I'm traveling twice a month. I didn't have the time or energy to give them, as Mark said, with what they deserved. But it wasn't a personal reason why I couldn't take you on. There are other people who could. And even if you meet someone, for example, at an opening, a party, or something like that, ask if you can meet with them later. And again, some people will, some people won't. I've had both experiences happen. And I think that it will be beneficial. And I think sometimes younger people feel afraid and feel like they'll be judged. Or even as a mentor, share your work. So we have a process at our job for curators where it's sort of like a tenure process for a promotion and sort of a review of your work, and it happens every 3 years. And everyone does it for the first time when they're entering the museum. And how you do that, how you structure your annual reviews, I've shared that with my other colleagues, not worried about what they're going to think in terms of how I formulated my essay or how I wrote my CV. It's just that this may be a template for you, and it's worked for me in the past, and I hope that it will work for you. And people are really grateful for that, because not everyone has to start off inventing the wheel over and over and over again. And I think generosity with your colleagues and reading their work, even if you might be really busy, it is really worthwhile, because at some point, and this is not why you do it, but people will do that for you, and people remember that and do that for others. So I think that being generous, not being competitive. I mean, you getting a raise, somebody else getting a raise doesn't impact you getting a raise or not. And it's not always this competitive, if you get it, I'm not going to get it. I think that just working together is a much more pleasant environment than stabbing each other in the back or not working with your colleagues at all.
Right. Yeah, I think just remaining engaged with your colleagues on every level, really, on their professional lives, personal as well. I mean, as much as is reasonable.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of, well, any really questions from our participants?
Can I interject?
Yeah, please.
As we've been talking, I've been listening, I realized that people have different configurations wherever they are, and I had the benefit of being in a very big department in an old big museum, and a lot of people are doing a lot by themselves in a smaller institution, and perhaps they are the PR director, the curator, all of that stuff. Right. And I think that even though I am not a joiner of things, I believe that this is where organizations like AAMC are important for people who don't have access to all that stuff, so that they can network and workshop, and those are also good places to do this to get this kind of knowledge. I agree with everything you just said, Tuliza. I think that being open, asking questions, networking, it is hard. It's hard to be, if you're shy, if you don't like being in big groups, all of that stuff, it can be an impediment to advancement. But there are options for one-on-one or smaller groups, and I think that a lot of times these organizations where you can meet people from other institutions and just listen and talk with them about the way that things go there or what their experience has been are incredibly great opportunities for growth. And I would encourage people to do it if they can. It was important to me when I was younger, particularly, to go to conferences and so forth.
That's really
okay, so slight technical issue. I found the questions that were being asked. It took me a minute. And so one of them has to do specifically to Tuliza, how much the change of political leadership in the U.S. May have affected professional relationships, if at all.
Are they talking about the new administration?
I expect so, yeah. I mean, I think in general, but surely changes may have been bigger in the past, 12, 18 months than before.
I think that our budget for the Smithsonian is allocated by Congress. So if they're not getting along and not passing a budget, certainly that impedes upon us. I think that I was just reading an article about how hate crimes have increased 5% within the last 2 years, and that's a very inaccurate number, because most police precincts don't report hate crimes, and most people who are victims of hate crimes don't report it to the police. So we're just talking about the ones that have been reported, and certainly we've had incidents. I think that probably the most public one was the noose being left in the museum, and certainly I'm sure we get threats all the time. I believe we're probably the #1 terrorist target on the wall, but that is pretty typical of a lot of African American museums. I used to think that, and this is not within administration. I mean, My father's museum he got a lot of death threats in various museums he worked in, crosses burned, bomb threats. I used to think all museums had that until I started working outside of ethnic-specific museums. I thought that was the museum field, so it never.
Wow.
I thought everyone got bomb threats on a regular basis. I did not know they did not. So it is something I think that I don't see necessarily a huge change in terms of how our museum practically is affected, but I think that the change, and probably for a lot of people, it creates a lot of angst. And I think at our museum in particular, we're talking about rapid response to situations. And that's something that museums generally don't always do because it's very difficult. I know that when the civil unrest happened in Cincinnati, what was that, 13 years ago or so, the Cincinnati Museum Center put up an exhibition dealing with civil unrest in Cincinnati within 6 months of the rioting, and really putting it in perspective. So I think that we're having discussions on that level, and certainly we're responding via social media and via the media in general. We also respond in terms of how we collect. So are we on the ground in terms of the Women's March, collecting things right then and there, which is something that a lot of museums don't do. From an art perspective, no one has ever, this is new to me. And so I think that who's to say how that's going to change? I can't predict that. But I think that maybe there's a lot of uncertainty that is new for almost all Americans in terms of what's going to happen next. And definitely institutions that rely on government funding, cultural institutions, but cultural institutions have always been threatened with government funding. I think throughout my experience working in the field, since maybe the early NEA controversy, there has been a lightning rod about that. But certainly we see ourselves as a place, and our administration sees our purpose to challenge some of these things. So I feel a freedom to go out and make statements that I might not feel free to do at a majority or historically white art museum for fear of repercussions, which I don't fear at my current institution.
That's great. I should try to get a few more of these questions in since I'm only just finding them. So one of them has a little more specifically to do with the AAMC mentorship program, and that we've talked a lot about sort of mentoring on site when your colleagues are with you, but I wonder if there are any thoughts about how you might foster those kinds of relationships when you're not actually in the same city with your mentee or mentor. It seems like a challenging question. I don't know if there are thoughts about that.
I'm not sure I understand the question. What is the question?
Well, I think it's specifically to do with, so the AAMC sets up these relationships where the two people are, in different institutions, different cities, and the only opportunities to get together are, for example, at the annual meeting or otherwise. It's a good question as to how you can build a relationship when it's so sort of circumscribed and limited.
Pick up the phone.
Okay. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, just talk. Talk after work. It's not, I don't think you have to be in person. Most of my mentors I don't meet with in person. I just call them up and talk on the phone, because eventually, if it's a good pair, you'll form a friendship and you'll want to talk to that person. Sometimes it's not always the right fit, but other times it's a great fit and you'll form lifelong friendships with that person, and it will evolve from being a mentor-mentee relationship to being a much more equal relationship as that mentee evolves in the field. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And actually that kind of feeds in nicely to the next question, which has to do precisely with more sort of peer-to-peer relationships in terms of team building. I wonder if the kind of senior and junior staff relationships can kind of work as well in a more equal situation?
I think for us, it happens all the time. But for people in our department, for example, as I mentioned, we're down curators. And so our collection manager has been curating exhibitions. She's an art historian, and she can do it. And it doesn't take any pushing really to get her to do it. And she's become quite good at it. But we also make ourselves available to her to go over checklists, to troubleshoot issues, to look at chat labels, so all of that stuff. I think when I was quite junior, someone always had to read my labels, and before it went to the publishing department, so that when they went up, they were in fairly good shape for them to look at, because I didn't really have the knowledge of what would be interesting to a museum audience. I knew what was interesting to an artist. I didn't know what was interesting to a museum artist or to a museum audience. So I had to sort of relearn all of that. And so I had the experience. And so I think that younger people also need to have the experience. And particularly if they've never written a museum label before, it's essential. Definitely. And we ask our interns to do that. You know, we have them, sometimes we have them do a hypothetical installation of maybe 10 objects centered around European painting, for example, where we hang works on paper. And sometimes they go up and sometimes they don't, but they go through the entire experience with us and with publishing. Everybody, I mean, people in publishing participate, people in museum ed participate. We try to do it across departments. And I think because we have those departments that are individual, we want them to know how that works because it's part of the museum culture. So I think that's really important, particularly for the junior staff, to make sure that the more senior staff pays attention and helps them along. I was even helped along by the department head, who didn't like doing it. He's the one who kind of threw me to the wolves, more or less, but not before he looked critically at my writing and encouraged me to go take a class at the University of Chicago in a program called Little Red Schoolhouse, where they go back to simple grammar to remind you what sentence structure is, how to avoid passive voice, etc. And I think that's a real problem in academia. We all know that.
I think that for me, in terms of working with someone on an equal basis, this idea, in my department, I don't feel, I mean, you have this structure, right? This layered level structure, but I don't necessarily feel that anybody's necessarily, you're talking about the word junior, but everybody has their role and everybody's role is important. So I don't feel, for me, that I'm necessarily different, that people might be senior to me versus people who might be junior. Is maybe a difference in job description or level of experience. So with my contractors and employees that I've had, one of the first things when they come in is, you know, where do you see yourself? What do you want to do with your career? So how can we help you move forward? You know, what kinds of things do you need to do? We have 2, you know, junior staff members working in the art department who we have a small special exhibition space in our dedicated art gallery. And my supervisor and I don't necessarily feel we need to curate every exhibition that goes in there. So we discussed it and we gave each of them one opportunity to curate that exhibition. It's up to them. I mean, clearly we're supervising this because this is maybe their first exhibition, but it's this idea that that's the experience you want. I mean, I curated my first Smithsonian exhibition at 23. And I was given a chance by my supervisors. I was an intern, and I was asked to come back the next year and curate this show, which helped launch my career, essentially, because it was originally a very unusual circumstance. But that's because my supervisors, who also became my mentors, and who are now my peers. I mean, the head of the department at National Portrait Gallery we're working together on projects. And she was my supervisor 27 years ago, right, or 20-something years ago. And it's really quite a lovely feeling to be working with people on an equal basis that you really looked up to and had so much to learn from, and now you're sort of working together. And I think that as long as you understand and that everyone has been in that particular position and help them along, I don't necessarily see this as very sort of separate, you know.
Yeah. Right. I think the idea that maybe Mark mentioned earlier on, that everybody does everything, actually kind of goes a very long way. It can mean that you might do photocopying, but also that, you know, your assistant could help curate a show, you know, with some supervision. I think it's kind of an all-purpose concept. Well, we're just about out of time. I think I've covered everyone's questions. I hope I have. So unless anyone has some sort of last thoughts, I'll see if the organizers have any other comments for us. I think that might cover it. So I will thank you both very much for speaking to this topic. It's been a real pleasure to help organize this, and hope everyone finds it helpful. So
Thank you.